Welcome to the Joyfulicity podcast. I'm your host, Laura Wakefield, and I'm privileged today to have as my guest, Campbell Will. Campbell is a physical therapist who specializes in teaching the art and science of breath work. And I was really excited when I connected with him on Instagram because breath work is talked about a lot now. Like it seems to be something that is reaching sort of mainstream attention, which seems funny to me because breathing is the oldest thing in the world. I mean, it's the most natural thing in the world, right? So why do we need people teaching us how to do it?
It's a really good question, and it's the question that I pretty much get almost every day, right? Is this idea that, well, I'm already breathing. What do I need to know?
Right.
What do I need to learn? And it's an interesting question to kind of ask ourselves. And I usually start by asking people, well, who taught you how to breathe? And often people go, well, nobody. Right. But someone taught us how to eat and to drive and to talk and to write and to communicate. But no one really taught us this fundamental aspect that really drives so many other systems in our body. And it's a question that I've kind of just continued to ask myself over the last decade, really, of, what is good breathing and what is not so good breathing, and how can we teach people, to lean into the former and minimize the latter. And I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of the reasons why today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I did have a question about that. First of all, let me ask you this. And it kind of goes with that. Why does this matter? Like, I mean, if we're automatically breathing and it's fundamentally basically keeping us alive, I'm 55 years old, somehow I'm still breathing. Why does this matter to learn proper breathing technique? How are we managing to do it wrong when it's such a natural process?
Yeah, great question. And so to me, there's kind of two aspects of this. We can think about breathing as a tool to restore optimal health in light of dysfunction. So my background, I worked in ICUs and neurosurgery wards and medical wards. And my role there as a respiratory physical therapist was, how do I get people back to baseline, right? But beyond that, we can then start to look at the breath as a tool for optimization. And I always like to use the example, as a physical therapist, people are walking all the time, but that doesn't mean that they can't be taught how to walk better, right? Because their walking might be giving them knee pain or back pain. And you might say, well, I'm walking and I've walked my whole life, but what if the way I'm walking is actually creating an imbalance in my body that's causing me pain, or it's limiting my range of motion or my ability to exercise or play with my kids? And so we don't say, well, everyone's walking, let's not address it. We see that actually there is an imbalance there, that we can maybe apply some tools to rectify that imbalance, and maybe we'll see an improvement in the symptoms that you're presenting with. And so I like to look at breathing through the exact same lens. The tricky part, and kind of coming back to your question, none of my clients, right, ever come to me saying, I've got a problem with my breathing. They come to me with anxiety or, an inability to tolerate stress or poor sleep or energy that's all over the place, chronic fatigue. And my job is to help them understand the link between how they're breathing and the symptoms that they're presenting with. And that's the hard part, because, rarely does breathing show up as dysfunctional breathing. In some circumstances it does, but more often than not, it will present in a different system. The most common thing that I see is anxiety. And if we just look at rates of anxiety, they're up 30% since COVID. They've only been rising in the last decade. The latest poll that went out is 50% of 18 to 26-year-olds identify with having anxiety, right? Half the population. That's crazy in my mind.
And that's young people.
Right? That's the highest prevalence. And so we then look at, well, what are the current management strategies for anxiety? And a lot of them don't have great outcomes, right? It's maybe pharmaceuticals, it might be talk therapy. Neither of those things are addressing one of the root causes of anxiety, which is a physiological disruption. We call it stress physiology for a reason, but here we are using tools that are addressing the mental state or the emotional state, and we're not doing anything about the underlying physiology. And so that's one of the big reasons I look to breathing and say, can, number one, we restore it to its optimal state, right? So that it is serving all of the functions in the body. And breathing doesn't just do breathing, right? It relates to the cardiovascular system and our posture and our mood and emotions and our attention and our learning. But then secondly, if I'm doing those things well, how do I start to use my breath as a tool, to gain that next step, the peak performance, if you will.
Well, that makes total sense to me because I've always known that my physical and emotional state can affect my breathing. If I'm nervous, I either stop breathing or I breathe very shallow. So I've always known that it can go that way, but I haven't always been aware that maybe the way I'm breathing could actually be affecting those things and causing them in the first place.
Yeah, so this is a bidirectional pathway, right? Mm-hmm. Most people have identified, yes, when I'm upset, I breathe this way. The most common one I ask people is like, how do you breathe when you're frustrated? And everyone goes,
Yeah, a big heavy sigh.
That happens there. And you weren't doing breath work. You didn't try to breathe that way. That was a reflection of your physical and mental and emotional state.
Right.
But if I asked you to breathe like you're frustrated for long enough, you'll start to feel frustrated. Mm-hmm. And there's really good evidence to show this relationship between respiratory pattern and emotional state, right? When you're excited, you breathe a very particular way. And that's different to when you feel tired or energized or calm or stressed. And so if we can kind of cultivate that self-awareness of what are my respiratory patterns, if you learn how you breathe when you're very calm, then you can use that pattern of breath when you're not feeling calm, to introduce to your nervous system, no, we want to feel calm. Because breathing is one of the most kind of influential aspects of our autonomic nervous system. So if you breathe quickly right now, if I ask you to breathe fast in and out up through your mouth, you'll start to feel a bit anxious. Your blood pressure will go up, your heart rate will go up, you'll start to sweat. There's a predictable response because your nervous system, right, is reading your breath as something stressful is happening because we're breathing quickly. But this is happening 22 to 25,000 times a day, these subtle fluctuations that most of us aren't paying attention to. And the question that I always pose to people is, well, how much of your anxiety is actually coming from the way you're breathing rather than the job or the relationship or the stressful thing that's happening, right? Of course, those things are triggers and they can be stimuli, but often what they do is they cause you to change how you breathe. And it's that disruption of your breathing and your physiology that then you perceive as, I feel anxious. And that's a really empowering piece of information, right? If I'm the one that's creating my anxiety, then there's something I can do about it. It's not coming from outside of me, it's actually coming from inside of me. And I've got the tool to kind of bring myself back into balance and perhaps, alleviate some of what I'm feeling.
Even if your circumstances didn't change, just by breathing differently, you can at least affect it. I mean, you're not going to solve whatever underlying problem by your breath work, but you can at least affect your physiology. Can you explain just briefly what the autonomic nervous system is? You mentioned that and how it's all tied to the breath. What exactly is that inside of our bodies?
Yeah. So to me, the way I love to describe it, the autonomic nervous system is kind of like the operating system of the body, right? It decides, should I be tired? Should I be stressed? Should I be happy? Should I be sad? Should I be tense, relaxed, and so on. And so the autonomic nervous system being the operating system, we can then kind of think about breathing as kind of the remote control to that operating system. But the autonomic nervous system, if we kind of zoom back a little bit, so we have the nervous system, the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, right? And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which were all of the other nerves all out throughout the body, right? So a lot of people have heard of the vagus nerve, for example. Sure. These are aspects of the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system, we can it's almost like these kind of subsets or these little kind of branching aspects. The peripheral has the autonomic nervous system, which, as the name kind of implies, automatic, and also the kind of somatic or conscious part of the nervous system, right? So I can decide to reach over and pick up my water bottle. Like that's a conscious part of my nervous system. And that's me deciding to move my arm and pick up the bottle. Right. The autonomic nervous system is much more the stuff going on in the background. I can't decide my heart rate to just speed up right now, right? I can't decide my digestion to slow down. I can't decide to start sweating, right? These things are under control of the autonomic nervous system, right? And so the things that are really keeping me alive moment to moment regulated by this autonomic side of the nervous system. The part of this that's really important is my autonomic nervous system is influenced by breathing. And so I can kind of influence, am I in a more, sorry, I'll continue this distinction, but the autonomic nervous system has this sympathetic, which most people have heard of, the fight or flight system.
Right.
And then the side is the parasympathetic, the so-called rest and digest. And so the way that I'm breathing, and it's not just breathing, right? It's also the posture that I'm holding and what's happening in my head and what's happening in my environment. My nervous system is making a decision, what's the appropriate state for me to be in right now, And if there's a tiger chasing me, is that kind of evolutionary example, the appropriate state is to be in a fight or flight response, run away, right? Send the blood flow out to my muscles, shut down digestion, pause my immune system, don't worry about inflammation. There's a survival situation happening right now.
Right.
So my autonomic nervous system is kind of always working in the background as like, what's the appropriate state for us to be in based on all the information at hand, right? And all the information at hand includes, how am I holding my body? How am I breathing? What's the internal narrative or story that I'm telling? What's happening outside of me? What can I hear, see, smell, right, through my 5 senses? And then the nervous system says, okay, based on all this information, this is the appropriate state. I should be stressed, or I should be calm, or I should be tired, right? And so that allows the nervous system to then dedicate or kind of preference, what should I be spending my energy on, And if I'm running from a tiger, digesting the food doesn't matter, because if I don't get away, tomorrow, there is no tomorrow,
Right.
So it kind of says, let's spend all of our energy right now on adrenaline, cortisol, and moving our legs.
And you see people have superhuman strength sometimes in those moments because everything else shuts off.
And the part of this, that if we zoom from being chased by a tiger, which hopefully anyone listening to this hasn't been chased by a tiger recently, but the nervous system responds very generically. I open up my laptop and there's a deadline that I missed and my boss is sending me a strongly worded email that I have the exact same autonomic response that says this is stressful, right? Which means shut down digestion, slow down the immune system, don't manage the inflammation, cortisol, adrenaline, blood flow out to my muscles, right? Because I need to deal with this threatening or stressful situation.
Right.
The problem that a lot of people face today is we're bombarded by stressful situations. The kids aren't ready for school, there's traffic, I haven't got my job done, the finances, the food that I'm eating, the sunlight, like all of those things are bombarding my nervous system. And we hear a lot of people talk about being stuck in the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
And that means I'm kind of preferencing surviving rather than thriving, right? I'm not going to repair the cells and manage the inflammation and heal, because my body thinks it's more important now to survive than it is to, heal and repair and regenerate and grow.
How do we get so far off track? Because yes, our lives are stressful, but they're not always stressful. It seems like some of this almost becomes a habitual body response. Once we've been stressed for so long, we just don't know how not to be anymore.
Yes, that's a perfect way to describe it. I like to use the analogy of like a gearbox. If I've been driving around in this stressful state for a really long time, that state becomes very familiar.
Yeah.
And the opposing side, right? Relaxation or calm or, just being bored as an example. Like a lot of people are bored because we can just pull out our phone, right? So I get used to the constant stimulus, the to-do list that never goes away, all of the responsibilities. And what happens is my nervous system and my body, right, loves nothing more than familiarity, because it's a lot easier to continue doing what I'm doing than it is to navigate this unknown terrain over here where there's uncertainty and there's unfamiliarity. And so a lot of people feel themselves kind of almost pulled back into that state of stress, right? Because my nervous system's like, I'm just going to keep doing what I know. I don't know what that relaxation thing over there is. Like, let's just go back to a never-ending to-do list. Because we've become really familiar with that level of stress and that really the level of stress hormones that are in my body as well. And the body wants to just perpetuate what it knows.
That makes sense. My daughter and I were watching a movie last night, and we were joking around that we no longer know how to watch a movie without also checking our phone and without also doing this other stuff. So we took our phones and we stuck them across the room, and it took a minute.
Yeah, right. You find yourself almost like drawn to it a little bit.
Yeah, to even just kind of settle into that situation. And we should want that. Hey, I get to relax now. But we aren't accustomed to that. We don't know. This feels unnatural now to us.
It's really fascinating, and I think phones are a big part of the problem for people because when my nervous system really gets to kind of switch off, let's go back not so far, how long's an iPhone been around? 10, 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, but prior to smartphones, what do people do when they sat on the train or the bus? They daydream or they talk or they communicate, or maybe they're sitting in a park just looking at the trees or the clouds. But now we're so prone to just like this moment of stillness and silence. I'm going to pull out my phone and check Instagram or get my email inbox, or I can't help but distract myself with stimulus. And that keeps my nervous system kind of in the on state, right? I'm kind of revving the engine all the time because I've kind of forgotten and lost the ability to be a little bit bored, to sit with myself and allow myself just a bit of time and space, and it's really interesting. Like, as I say this, I want to make it very clear that I'm not immune to this at all.
Oh, no, we all do it.
I feel myself kind of pulling my phone out and going, what? That was really like unconscious. I didn't decide that I want to be on my phone. There was this unconscious little driver of like, I guess I'm getting a little bit bored, and my nervous system goes, let's fill that void.
Even though you're already doing 3 other things. Seriously, like sometimes I'm like, when did it get this bad that I can't even just sit and watch a TV show without also doing, a couple of other things at the same time? And no wonder I'm feeling the effects of stress on the body, mind, and soul when I'm literally not ever shutting off, So tell me, if there's a correct way to breathe that we'll get to in a minute, there's incorrect ways. And I referenced a couple that I know I do. I'll breathe too shallow and I'll stop breathing. What are some of the breath mistakes that are super common that most of us are doing all the time without realizing we're doing it?
Yeah. So by far the most common that I see on a day-to-day basis kind of clinically is, where in my body am I breathing? Right. And so if we think of very simple, am I breathing kind of up? The chest, the shoulders, the collarbones kind of lifting up as I inhale and dropping down? Or am I breathing out, right? The lower part of the rib cage, we hear of belly breathing, but really, am I breathing up or am I breathing out? We do not want to be breathing up, right? And we can kind of talk of this flow-on effect.
Now I'm trying to think which way I'm doing it. Undoubtedly the wrong way.
And we can kind of, say, well, why do people breathe like that? And it can be from numerous things. It can be from sitting in a desk job. If you've ever hurt your back, if you've ever been pregnant and given birth, right? Like, these just a few simple examples of why might I be breathing into this upper part of my chest. And it can be a learned thing, right? Let's use the example of pregnancy. As you grow a baby, your diaphragm just got pushed out of the way. You couldn't breathe down and expand your rib cage because there was a growing baby in there. And so you learned, right? My body said, all right, well, I can't do that for the next 10 months. I'm going to breathe up here where I've got a little bit of room left. But then baby comes, and maybe, particularly when there's a C-section, right? Now there's a bit more trauma down in that space. So maybe I keep breathing up here. And then maybe a year's gone by or 5 years, and I've learned like that's just my breathing pattern now. Right. And because people tend to overlook and say, well, nothing ever happened to my breathing, they fail to recognize that actually that change in my breathing pattern is 100% going to influence the state of my nervous system, but also, how well my body is able to take oxygen and deliver it to my cells. And so when we breathe up here, there's just less opportunity for us to get oxygen into the cells to where we actually need it and where we produce energy. When we breathe down low, we use the diaphragm, we spread the rib cage out. We've got a lot more surface area. There's a lot more blood flow. And so we're just improving our ability to actually utilize oxygen. And oxygen is really the thing that keeps us alive. At a cellular level, without oxygen, there's not a lot we can do. That's the thing that fuels the engines.
Right. It's pretty critical. Yeah.
Break down food and repair cells and, mobilize everything, right, is relying on this relationship that we can produce energy with oxygen. And so number one that I commonly see is this kind of vertical breathing up into my chest or up into my shoulders. The second thing is, am I breathing with my nose or my mouth? Mouth breathing, not good, right? This thing is designed for communicating and for eating, right? And for expressing ourselves emotionally. It is not designed for breathing. It is a backup system, right? I can breathe with it. But when we look at, the nose and the intricate kind of anatomy that exists there, like This is 100% designed for us to breathe. It humidifies the air, it cleans the air, it warms the air, it slows it down and deposits it into the right part of my lungs. And it produces this really interesting molecule called nitric oxide, which is just produced in the sinuses and not produced in the mouth. And that molecule is antiviral, it's antibacterial, it's antifungal, right? And so this beautiful kind of design of the human body, right? As the air comes in, we clean it, we kill anything that's in the air that shouldn't be coming into our body. We prepare the air so my body can do as much as it can with it. The moment I open my mouth, that just goes out the window. We don't have that same process happening. And so, yes, I need to be able to breathe with my mouth, right? If I'm running up a hill, for example, I'm going to find it a lot easier I can just move more air. But when I'm sitting on the couch watching a movie, or I'm doing the grocery shopping or I'm driving the car, I should 100% be breathing entirely through my nose. But we see more and more, it's very common that people start to habitually breathe through their mouth when they don't need to be.
I think so many of us, myself included, have almost chronic sinus problems now. And I think a lot of it's inflammation, just generalized body inflammation, pollutants in the air around us. But I've struggled with breathing through my nose for many, many, many years. So what do you do? Like, I guess you have to start with solving whatever's going on that's making it difficult to breathe through your nose, right?
Exactly. But there's also, the old kind of, you don't use it, you lose it, so to speak. The more you don't breathe with your nose, the harder it gets to breathe with your nose.
Oh,
right?
really?
And so what happens a lot of the time is people, they hear this information, they say mouth breathing bad, nose breathing good. I'm going to try and breathe with my nose. And they find it really tricky, like as you've probably experienced. It does feel a little bit harder than breathing with my mouth. But for a lot of people, they go, that feels a bit uncomfortable. It feels maybe a bit claustrophobic. It feels like I'm not getting enough air. And they go back to mouth breathing, right? Because the time that they've perhaps spent mouth breathing has made nasal breathing just a little bit trickier. And it's going to take a little bit of adaptation before that becomes comfortable again. So the first thing I would say to people is it's not an overnight fix. You can't just decide, I'm going to go back to nasal breathing and it's going to be okay tomorrow. It will take a little bit of time, and there's kind of other things that we need to address in terms of your tolerance to carbon dioxide. It's more of a chemistry relationship. But that's the thing that makes me feel like I need to breathe. So often when people close their mouth and start breathing through their nose, they feel like they're not getting enough air. Yeah. But that's just, there's actually a little bit more carbon dioxide in my body now, and my brain's kind of responding and going, more CO2, and we won't go down the depths of respiratory physiology today, but that's a very, adaptable response. I just need to expose myself to a little bit more carbon dioxide and my brain becomes a little bit less sensitive and nasal breathing gets easier and easier and easier.
So it is reversible. It's 100%. Not like, because like it resonated with me about the pregnancies. I don't know if you know that I have 9 children.
I didn't.
I've had a lot of pregnancies, and undoubtedly that makes sense as to why I really created that. And it's reversible, right? Like, if 100%. I get the coaching and the help that I need, I can improve this.
Yes. And it's really important for people to remember that because, sometimes I'm working with people that have been breathing dysfunctionally for 40, 50, 60 years, and we see really amazing results because the rule that I kind of stand by and that I share with everyone is your body never loses the ability to adapt. You just need to change the stimulus, and understand, well, what are the stepping stones that I can, take to get back to perhaps breathing a little bit more functionally or optimally. But you've not lost the ability to adapt, And so as an example, your diaphragm, right, will have kind of learnt to be a little bit tight, right? Yeah. Because of the numerous pregnancies. And then what happens afterwards in a learned breathing pattern. But if you get in there and start stretching your diaphragm, right, you create a little bit more space. It's, there's this beautiful grace of the human body that's like, oh yeah, right? We do have a little bit of movement down there. That's right. I can breathe with this muscle. So there's this kind of inner knowing, for lack of a better term, that let's say you've been breathing, incorrectly for 30 years. It's not going to take you 30 years to recorrect it. It's just, okay, all right, I need to address the mechanics of how I'm breathing. I need to maybe address my physiology, how my brain's responding to my breathing. And then there's some tools that I can use around kind of like managing my nervous system state. And those things over time are, it's impossible that you don't adapt because your entire nervous system is always adapting, right? It doesn't just choose some things to adapt to and not to others. It is just an adaptation machine. And so by you kind of changing the inputs of now I breathe this way and I move this way, like my nervous system starts to learn that the same way that it learned to breathe differently during pregnancy.
I love that, because we all kind of know that and understand that about other muscles in our body, that if we go to the gym, start working out, at first it will be hard, but then we'll gain strength and it will improve. We don't think about that with things like our diaphragm that are basically,
no, it's interesting.
We don't even think about our diaphragm. How often do we even think about it unless we're 9 months pregnant? Then we're very aware of it. But, it's just not something that I think as people, most of us are giving enough credit to. So if I go through the process and the hard work and I get this better, what kind of benefits will I have in my life? Like, why is this worth it to me to go through that difficulty?
Yeah, I mean, such a good question. If we just look at it purely, physiologically, and let's answer this question a couple of different ways, but just physiologically, let's say all we did was we moved you from mouth breathing to nose breathing. That is, we've shown in numerous studies, that's 18% more oxygen uptake at your cells, right? That just means 18% more energy, right? And I don't mean energy to run up a hill. I mean energy to repair cells and manage inflammation and mount immune response. But 18% more oxygen uptake at the cell through nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, right? But it also comes back to, this, what I like to term self-regulation. By restoring my breathing, right, and doing this hard work and moving my diaphragm, and establishing a little bit more control, I now sit in the driver's seat, right? I can change my breathing to make me feel more alert or make me feel more calm, right? If I'm laying in bed at night and I'm feeling like, why is my mind racing? I need to go to sleep. I can use my breath to tell my nervous system it's time to go to sleep, If I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling really groggy, but I've got to go and jump on a podcast, right? I can breathe in a way that's going to stimulate and give me a little bit more energy. And so when we explain it that way of like, would it be useful to you to have a little bit more influence over how you feel at any given moment, right? You need to feel more alert, you can feel more alert. You need to feel more calm, you can feel more calm. And so that tool of learning how to drive, this vehicle that we're all inhabiting, through control of my breath, I think is a big kind of like benefit that people are seeking. Rather than, let's go back to those same two examples. I can't sleep or I'm feeling wound up at the end of the day. Most people, I need a glass of wine, right? To wind down. I've had a stressful day. I'm not a anti, or in the morning I either get up and I need to drink a coffee. So we're relying on these external inputs to change how I feel. And there's nothing, I love coffee and I love wine.
Right, but it's not good to need them.
Exactly.
There's a difference between enjoying them and needing them.
And it's really interesting, what happens if you run out of coffee in the morning? What happens if you drink wine? And then you realize, that's a crutch. Like, if I don't have that, it really changes my response. Now I'm really grouchy, or now I'm really fatigued, or whatever it might be. And so understanding like, there's an internal tool that I can use that never runs out, that doesn't require any equipment, that's free, that's with me all the time. And so that kind of understanding of being able to be a little bit more in control of your experience is a huge benefit.
I've done some pretty extreme hiking in my day, often at high altitude. And when you get up around 14, 15, 16,000 feet, you really understand what not enough oxygen will do to you. I mean, your brain can't. There was a time when I was having such low oxygen that I literally couldn't communicate with my own legs easily to do what I wanted them to do. It was that bad. And just everything slows down, shuts down. And I don't know why I've never put that connection together until this moment when you said, could you use an extra 18% oxygen? And then I remembered that feeling of not having enough and realizing that I probably don't have enough now either, not at that same extreme. But what would 18% more feel like?
Yeah, and it's really great that, like when people that haven't experienced altitude, what you just described feel, it's a little bit kind of like, well, I don't know, what did it feel like? I've experienced it. I know exactly what you're talking about. Right. And so if you kind of take that and you extrapolate it kind of back to like day to day, and there's a kind of theory that's being put out there at the moment that the absence of oxygen is the presence of disease, right? in terms of things like metabolic disease, and if we look at cells and how do they turn into cancers, there's a pretty strong evidence to say lack of oxygen, right? We're not getting oxygen there. The cell still is requiring energy. So it goes into this kind of backup energy production, which produces lactic acid and metabolic waste, and that buildup of waste that then perhaps starts to influence disease. And so when we say like 18% more oxygen, most people kind of think of like, oh, it's just like more air that's coming in. We're really kind of thinking about, no, what's going on at the cells? What's going on at the mitochondria of the 30 trillion cells in your body that are literally keeping you alive? That's where we're really thinking of, and I optimize my breathing, I optimize my ability to deliver oxygen to all of the mitochondria, right? And to remove waste. And that's this relationship of, respiratory physiology. It's the chemistry that's kind of changing based on my breathing.
I love that. That's something really that I'm thinking about in a new way after talking with you, that it's, yes, we're breathing well enough that we're waking up in the morning and we're still alive today and we're doing okay. But are we really thriving? And how much longer might we live if we're treating these cells and these organs in our bodies and giving them all the nourishment that they need? Like we might actually live longer.
There's a beautiful kind of, I guess, idea in the old kind of yogic text, like from the pranayama tradition, that instead of, how long we live, we all have a number of breaths. What say you, Laura, breathe 20 times a minute and I breathe 8 times a minute, right? I'm just going to use my breaths up a lot slower, and that's going to take me a lot longer. And it's really interesting. And this is a big kind of bugaboo for me because I'm so immersed in it. But if you go back to a lot of those old yogic texts and traditional Chinese medicine and stuff that's been around for quite a while, they talked about a breathing rate of 6 to 8 breaths a minute as being ideal, right? If you go back, a few hundred years and you look at medical textbooks, we start to see them talking about kind of 8 to 12 breaths a minute. When I went through university, we talked about 12 to 16 breaths a minute. If you go to a medical clinic today, normal breathing is 16 to 20 breaths a minute. And that just bothers me. Like, what we're doing is we're just moving the goalposts, and that allows us to not identify that there's a problem, right? You breathing 20 times a minute versus breathing 10 times a minute completely changes your blood pressure, how hard and fast your heart is beating, the state of your nervous system, whether you're burning through glucose or fats preferentially. Like, the list really goes on. So I think we're at a big disservice to people by saying 18 times a minute, oh, that's normal. It's not, it really isn't. And it's just that we've allowed ourselves to just say, oh, it's not that important. What happens if we just tack on a couple of extra breaths per minute? We'll just call that normal.
It's just breathing, right? Yeah.
It's just breathing, right? It's just the thing that keeps us alive.
Right.
But we see a very similar thing, when we look at something like blood sugar, there's this cutoff that above this number, you have diabetes, below you don't, right? And a lot of people, they go to the doctor and they're very close to that number and they say, you're still in the normal range. Right. But you might just under clinical diagnosis of diabetes, but you go, that's normal. We're not going to do anything about it. We're going to wait until you have a disease before we manage it. And this is what I see. Someone measures their respiratory rate and says, you're breathing 19 times a minute. That's within normal limits. But that person, I guarantee, also has anxiety or has a very low tolerance to stress. Or we say normal limit and we just let it slide.
Wow, that's interesting. So I saw in your website or not your website, I think it was when I was talking with you before, that you incorporate breath work into meditation. Talk to me about that, because I know that sometimes we try to use it during meditation, we try to slow down our breathing, but what else do we do? Like, how else does it apply to meditation? Because I love meditation. It's something that I'm really trying to learn to get better at, but it's not easy to learn.
No, it's not. And this is why I think, so this kind of comes back, right, to what we were talking about earlier. You're sitting on the couch watching a movie, wanting to use your phone, is we've become very accustomed to a certain state of our nervous system.
Yeah.
You go from that level of activity that you're used to, and then you sit on a cushion and be quiet and be still. What happens? Your mind goes, right? Yeah. Like, you've never been busier in your mind than that moment, because we've got rid of a lot of the stimulus that's usually keeping me, entertained or just kind of like active that way. And so if I just sit and I let my breathing happen, I'm kind of, almost fighting against my nervous system. But if I can use my breath to kind of bring my nervous system down, into a state that's a little bit more calm or that's a little bit slower, I'm often going to find the stillness and the silence of meditation a little bit more comfortable, right? Instead of me forcing my mind into submission and saying, we're going to sit here and be quiet, don't think of anything.
Which means you're thinking of everything.
Yeah. Instead, it's like, what can I do with my breathing? And focus on my breathing, right? There's the meditative aspect, is singular point of focus. So I'm very present with my breath, but I'm breathing in a way that creates a predictable response in my nervous system, and that can be one of two things. I can breathe rhythmically. So if I breathe in, for example, for 4 seconds and out for 4 seconds, and I maintain this very consistent rhythmical breath, that is setting up, something for my nervous system to follow. Here comes the breath. Yep, breath arrives, and then breath. Oh, yep, there it goes again, and then here it comes. And so there is the point of my focus, which for a lot of meditative practices, it's notice the breath coming in and notice the breath going out. When you get distracted, come back to the breath. But if I just tweak my breathing a little bit, and I go slightly slower than I'm used to, that creates a shift in the state of my nervous system, and it makes it a lot easier for me to focus. Now, let's say I'm very distracted. If I start to lengthen my exhale, so I'm breathing in 4 and maybe now I'm breathing out for 6, that longer exhale is linked to the parasympathetic part of the nervous system, right? So that's going to allow me to kind of swing a little bit further into that state of rest, of stillness, And so my breath becomes a little bit of a rudder, it's saying, oh, we need to kind of slow down a little bit more because my mind's still kind of trying to take me off that way. And then the final kind of way I tend to use it and teach is that rather than going from, right, let's say I've got up, do you meditate in the morning or in the evening, Laura?
Usually in the morning.
In the morning. So let's say you've woke up, you've checked your inbox, you've got ready for the day. There's just the level of mental activity, the to-do list is building up, the commitments for the day, and then you stop and you try and be still. And so what a lot of people often experience is kind of this overflow. I've sat my body down and be still, but my mind is kind of continuing with the momentum of the morning that is picked up. And so what I'll tend to do is use breathing in a little bit more of an active kind of dynamic way. So I'll take a few really nice big breaths and then do some breath holds and then big breath. And then I stop and I sit and I be quiet. And the breathing has kind of interrupted the pattern of my mind and of my to-do list. And then I can sit and I'm much more, it's like a little stepping stone to the meditative state. What might usually take me 10 minutes to get there, where it's like, oh, here it is. This is meditation. It might only take me a minute because I've kind of hijacked my state by using breathing I like to use the example, you shake the snow globe and then you let it all settle back down. And that's exactly what kind of happens, this relationship between our physiology and our psychology. So we kind of shake our physiology by breathing lots and then holding the breath and doing something a little bit more, active or dynamic. And then we let it rest and fall down into stillness. And I personally find that, oh, here I am. The activity in my mind has already stopped, right? I'm very present with my body. And now I can, sit in my meditative state for a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's interesting because it seems like, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems don't really actually know what's going on. So they're just completely responding to whatever stimulus you're sending to them. If it's tiger or if it's rest, they can't actually see that. So, we're sending stimuli that's teaching,
And this is where it really becomes interesting. So what my nervous system is perceiving is external and internal. If I curl my shoulders and I drop my chin down on my chest and I curl into a ball, my nervous system is perceiving vulnerable, fear, right? There might be nothing in my environment that suggests that, but my posture says, are we protecting ourselves from an income? What's going on? Yeah. Same as up here, right? We're the only species in the world that can give ourselves worry or anxiety today for something we have to do week. I have to do this presentation, or I have to speak to my boss, or I've got to have that difficult conversation with my partner. I can give myself worry and stress and anxiety and change my physiology right now just by thinking about it, right? So when we think of my nervous system, like you said, it's just responding to everything. A lot of the times we're very unconscious of what signals am I sending? We look around and we think environment, is it the job? Is it the traffic? Is it, But what about my posture? What about my breathing? What about my story that I'm telling? So, and a lot of people will breathe shallow or fast, and they'll hold tension in their body, and then they'll tell stories, right? And that is as important in terms of what my nervous system is responding to all the stuff out there. And so, this idea of, I like the term self-awareness, right? Am I aware of what my posture is doing to how I feel right now? Am I aware of what my breathing is doing to my nervous system right now? My internal narrative, because those things I can change. I can't change that I don't like my boss, or that my kids are being difficult today, or that the traffic is bad on the way to the airport. Like, those things are just out of my control. But when I'm sitting in the car, tensing my jaw and my shoulders are up by my ears, there is something I can do about that, right? And that's where this kind of self-awareness, and to me, when you're aware of your breathing, you become a lot more aware of your body. You become a lot more aware of the story that you're telling, because your breathing's only ever happening right now. You can't breathe in the past. You can't breathe in the future. So when you kind of you develop this ability to become present with your breath, you'll notice my breathing feels shallow, or I'm holding my breath, I'm not breathing at all. Yeah. And then what do I want to do about that? Oh, I'm going to start breathing again, or I'm going to slow my breath down, or I'm going to take a nice, slow, deep breath. And those things immediately impact the information that my nervous system is responding to.
Well, so few years back, I started in my 50s taking ballroom dance lessons, and it's the funnest thing in the world. However, the first time that they talked me into doing a competition, here I am, 53, getting up to do a dance competition. And the minute you get there, it's like a tiger's chasing you. You feel that, although there really isn't one. But even when we need that parasympathetic, being able to learn to control it, that's what one of my dance teachers would always look at me, because I would stop breathing. We would start to do the competition, and I would literally stop breathing. But these dances are several minutes long. You can't not breathe that long, right? You have to breathe. So she'd be like, breathe, 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 and so I think sometimes, that nervous system doesn't understand levels either, that I'm perceiving the situation as equally dangerous to that tiger chasing me. And I'm not actually going to die. There's nothing really awful, and truly calming it down is going to benefit me more than having it ramped up, so that I can think clearly and do what I need to do.
Exactly. And a lot of times, we've learned, and I'm going to take a guess here, and you can kind of confirm or deny, but for a lot of people, it wasn't just the ballroom dancing. You probably learned a lot earlier in life, when something super stressful is happening, we hold our breath, because that's what you did however long ago. Someone was yelling at me and I held my breath and tried to feel small. That is the learned behavior. So the next time I feel like I'm in a similar situation, my nervous system goes, what did we do last time? Hold the breath. And so people, they forget that it's a protective mechanism in a way, and it's a learned behavior. You didn't decide, here comes the dance, I'm going to hold my breath now, right? Right. Your nervous system went, this is really scary. What do we do in scary situations? Stop breathing. And again, why does that happen? It's one less thing that you need to be paying attention to. So you're now more present with, where is the threat coming from? Like, stop breathing, right. Stop moving, like, where is it? And so it's this kind of inbuilt mechanism that, unless we become aware of it, it will continue to change the way that I'm feeling and change the level of my energy and what's happening in my mind. And something else you said that I want to kind of come back to, that this isn't to say that parasympathetic good, sympathetic bad, right. Levels. We need to have access to the sympathetic nervous system, because that's how I get up in the morning, and that's how I get hard stuff done, and that's how I complete deadlines. But it's like, do I want to overshoot that mark and go into complete full-blown panic and anxiety when maybe that's not the appropriate response? And if I don't control my breathing, that's often what will happen, is I'll drive myself there, because it's like this kind of upward spiral. I feel a bit stressed and anxious, which makes me breathe a little bit faster and shallower. That faster and shallower breathing accelerates my heart rate and makes me feel more stressed and anxious, which makes me breathe faster and shallower. And, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I feel panicked. And so having that self-awareness of, I'm feeling stressed and anxious, let me make sure I don't let my breathing get too far away from me, shallow and far, right? I'm going to breathe smooth and steady and slow. And yes, it is still stressful because I'm about to dance in front of 50 people, but let my breathing kind of just tap the brake a little bit and say, nervous system, this is where we want to stay. You don't want to be in a completely parasympathetic state in that environment, because
No, you need some of that to fuel you to do what, the hard
right?
thing.
And to know that the stakes are high and to focus on it and to pay attention and give it your best, right? And so it's like me having a little bit more of a way to regulate and say, this is the right level of autonomic arousal, right? This is the right amount of my sympathetic nervous system versus overshooting the mark, because earlier in life, I learned this pattern or I learned this behavior when something scary happens or when something fearful is happening. And so then I can choose, this feels at about the right level for me to perform, right? Or to do whatever task it might be for each individual.
Yeah. And I think we don't even realize we're doing it. I think the stopping the breathing until we're ready to pass out practically. And then we notice, oh my goodness, I need to breathe. But I think sometimes when we see people that seem so calm in a setting like that, I used to be heavily involved in theater, and people would always tell me, you don't even seem nervous. This comes so easily to you. And I would laugh. I just had done it for long enough that I had learned how to keep breathing while on stage. I was just as nervous as they were. And you want to be. That actually fuels you. It actually is the hype that you need, but you have to keep breathing. And that's when all of those outward appearance things start to show to other people that you're nervous, when the sweat and you're fainting away and all of that. But it doesn't mean that you're not nervous anymore or not excited or not dialed in. It's just that you're controlling it a little bit.
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing, people often think courage means you're not fearful, but I think courage is you act while you're scared. You are fearful, but you do it anyway because you got the tools. And exactly as you're describing, it's not that all of a sudden I'm not nervous anymore. It's just that I've learned to stay composed while I'm nervous, right? I've learned to stay in the driver's seat, even though it is terrifying. Like, right. I teach workshops and sometimes big workshops, and I've been doing it for years now. And I remember the first workshop I did, right? It's just my stomach turning and sweating, and I wrote out every word I was going to say that day. And now, I can present in front of 50 people and it doesn't mean I don't get nervous. I've learned to regulate how I feel. And okay, I'm getting a little bit beyond, my mind's racing. Oh, wait, let me come back to my breathing and let me just turn down the volume a little bit. Cool, I'm back. Yes, this isn't that big. I'll be okay. Here's why. I've done this before. So just that little, I love the idea of like a volume dial. It's like, gone up a little bit too high. I'm just going to turn it down a little bit. Or vice versa, actually, I'm feeling like I'm not giving this enough attention. This is important. I'm going to turn the volume up, right? I need to be more dialed in because right now I'm feeling kind of lethargic and it's not important, So it's not always too nervous, too anxious, need to calm down. Sometimes it's like, I'm not, this is really important and I need to kind of turn up, And that comes back to the same tool. It's like, how do I use my breath to influence my nervous system to get to the appropriate state for the situation that I'm in?
Well, and I imagine like with you, the first time that's pretty funny, actually, that you're thinking, I'm here in this workshop to teach people how to manage anxiety, but I'm feeling anxiety. I imagine as you go along and do that you start to trust the process more, that I've managed this many, many times before. I know that this will work. So that can keep from ever spiraling in the first place. Yeah.
And it's such a, this is not necessarily to do with breath work, but I think it's a really important lesson. It's something that I've kind of learned and taught myself, that the way that I like to teach around the nervous system, but also the brain, is it's a prediction machine, right? It really wants to predict what's going to happen. And what it uses to predict is previous data or previous information. So the fact that I've taught 20 workshops and they've all gone okay, now I start to predict this one will go okay as well. But that first workshop, I have nothing in the background as data. So my brain predicts worst possible outcome. You're going to forget what to say. Everyone's going to laugh, because that's a predictive mechanism that says, let's prepare for the worst and hope it doesn't happen. We do have a negative bias in our brain that says, what is the worst? If we think evolutionarily, the twig breaks, we want to assume it's a tiger and be wrong rather than be like, it was probably just tiger gets me.
Right.
So we're designed to predict that what could go wrong, what might I miss, what could happen. But when I've started to stack up a little bit of evidence, now I've done X amount of workshops, or now I've had X amount of conversations, or I've gone and done the ballroom dancing a few times, my brain is going to predict based on, well, the last one I was really nervous, but it actually went fine and I had a great time. That is going to influence how you feel about the next one. And we're using these examples of, teaching a workshop or doing ballroom dancing, but it's true of anything, right? The more evidence that I can kind of provide myself by doing the thing, and we can all attest to this. I don't even need to say most people maybe feel this. Everyone does this. Like, think of the last time you had to do something difficult and how much worse it was going to be in your head, right? We build it up. It's all going to go terrible. And you get to the other side, you go, that wasn't so bad. I ask anyone and everyone, right? On the other side of that challenge, did it go as badly as you thought? And everyone says, no, I thought it was going to go, it actually went fine, So we know we do this. And so we can start to use that as when I start to predict that everything's going to go wrong, is just to go, wait, I always do this and it's always okay. Let me just use that information now, right, to predict that this will probably be okay as well. I don't need to go into worst case or what could go wrong. I'm just going to stick with it always works out in the end. So this will be no different.
Well, and one thing that has helped me too is just to reframe my thinking about those feelings, whether they're good or bad, because like when you start to feel all that anxiousness and all that, the stomach and the sweat and the nerves, you think that's bad, but it's actually the exact same thing you feel right before you get on a roller coaster, or if you go to a scary movie, and you paid money to do that on purpose because we reframed that in our mind as excitement. This in our mind is anxiety. And I imagine learning to control the breath gives you the presence of mind to redirect those thoughts rather from good or bad to just, this is my task at hand, this is what I'm doing now. So we don't have to go there.
Exactly. There really is. And if we just looked snapshot physiology of someone that's excited and someone that's anxious and scared, we can't really tell them apart. The only way we tell them apart is, do you want to be here or you don't, Right. And so, like you're saying, is I can actually start to work with, yes, I'm feeling these things. Am I labeling them as bad, anxious, things are going to go wrong? Or perhaps I can label them as, this is me preparing. It means a lot. I'm focused, and start to, instead of saying, I'm not going to feel these things, impossible, I'm going to change what I labeled and how I feel about the sensations in my body. Because like you said, your heart's pounding before you get on the roller coaster. Your heart's pounding before you do this scary thing. So you can label heart pounding, it means something is bad, or heart pounding, I'm really excited.
Yeah, heart pounding means that I'm about to have to give my all to something or to dive into something, just changing that. So I looked at all of your pages and everything, and I saw that you do physical therapy, you do teaching the breath work to individuals, right? But you also teach other people to become breathwork practitioners. Did I get that right? You
did. So kind of, I found just over the years that there was a bit of a hole in, if you go, whether it's to a physical therapist or to a health coach or to, any health practitioner, there's a lack, like you pointed to right at the start of this conversation, there's a lack of understanding of, well, what is good breathing and how do I restore it and how do I optimize it? And so I found that rather than me just working with individuals, what if I can equip, health professionals to have this same lens that they can look through and be able to assess and be able to treat breathing. And so over the last kind of 4 years, I've really been just kind of refining and working with, groups of small health professionals that are not wanting to, put down the fact that they're a whatever profession and just do breath work. It's like, how do I integrate breathing into all of the other skills that I have? Mm-hmm. And that's where I see breath as most effective. It's a complementary tool, If you, like all the stuff we spoke about today, if you can learn to kind of get the nervous system, on board or into a different state, then all of the other things, the exercise, the diet, the communication, all those things just work a little bit better because my nervous system is in the appropriate state. My breathing is delivering oxygen to my cells and removing waste. All these things kind of fit like pieces of a puzzle. And when we have all those pieces, I think that's where we get transformation, or we get healing, or we get progress. So I've kind of really, focused my time and effort on, creating what I wish I had 5 or 6 years ago as I started to into this world of like, what do I look for? How do I help it? Where are the things that I can address and move the needle most?
Absolutely. So I have a final question for you, but before I ask you that, tell everybody, if they want to work with you or learn more about this, where can they find you? Where can they go to look you up?
Yeah, awesome. Everywhere I'm at Breath Body Therapy. So whether it's Facebook, Instagram, my website, my email is Campbell at Breath Body Therapy. So if you just search Breath Body Therapy, you'll find me. I'm most active on Instagram. That's where I like to just share as much of the educational content as I can. For those that maybe are health professionals that are interested in, developing their ability to use breath, we run cohorts 3, sometimes 4 times a year. So the next one is in October. And to anyone else that's kind of like, I say this when I have conversations, that a lot of times people will have heard this conversation. They go, that's all good and well, but for me, we think we are excluded from this information for some reason. Oh, I'm sure that works for some people, but my anxiety or my panic or my sleep issues, they can't be solved by breathing, And so I would just encourage, if that's popping into your head as you listen to this conversation, just kind of approach it with curiosity. In my experience, over the last decade, there is no disease or dysfunction that isn't worsened by poor breathing, nor improved by good breathing. And so I'm not here standing and saying breathing fixes everything. I'm not that naive, nor is it that simple. But if I can kind of fix my breathing, does it then give me more energy, or does it allow me to be less anxious? And then that opens up the door to the next tool that might help you along the way. And I think for a lot of people, it's almost like this domino. We push this first domino over, which is I start breathing in a way that supports my body and supports my nervous system. Then maybe I start sleeping better. And now that I'm sleeping better, I've got a little bit more energy to exercise. And now I'm exercising, I'm feeling a little bit more confident. So I approach, it's this really interesting catalyst for a lot of other changes that down the line you're going, wait, did that all come back from changing how I breathe? You know? And so the last thing I would leave people with is we don't try and get better at breathing to get better at breathing. We try to get better at breathing to really allow the body to do what the body knows how to do, right? As we support it in moving into the appropriate state for healing or for recovery or for growth. But a lot of that comes back to, what is my breathing telling my body and my nervous system?
Absolutely. And from what I've been hearing you say, it can affect things that we never thought it could, like insomnia, even maybe weight loss, maybe, like we all know certain things, maybe anxiety. We've all heard that breathing can help with that. But I don't know that I would have ever thought breathing could help me lose weight, or breathing could help me, to sleep better, or some of these things that seem to have no relation to our breath.
Exactly. And it still surprises me today, Laura. I work with people that their digestive issues go away. And they didn't come to me to say, use breathing to fix my digestive issues. They also had anxiety, but we uncovered, actually the state that you're in while you eat, right, causes you to be bloated and to have pain and to react to food. And it's not that you have necessarily a sensitivity to a certain type of food. It's more the state that you're in, because your breathing kept you in a sympathetic nervous system, meaning there's no blood flow in your digestive system. There's no digestive enzymes. And so, the way that you breathe will shift you into a digestive state. And that might clear up a lot of these digestive issues that you've been trying to solve for a long time. And, I see it a lot with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia.
Yeah.
And so again, people think, what? How does that relate to breathing? But if we zoom in and understand how your cells create energy, and if they're not getting oxygen, what happens to the accumulated waste, it all starts to make a little bit more sense. And it's, there's layers of depth that we can go into here, but for those that are listening, is just kind of, again, come back to curiosity. What if, my digestive issues could be helped by me actually correcting how I'm breathing? What if this long-term insomnia was actually to do with the state that my nervous system's in, and I've forgotten how to find the off switch, which I can practice through breathing? Or what if the pain that I'm in, my pain threshold or perception changes based on the state of my nervous system? I'm more sensitive to pain when I'm in that state of stress and anxiety because it's protective. And so all these things that, if you're thinking, but how would it really help with this? I would love to have a conversation with you. Send me a message on Instagram and say, this is my problem. How does breathing relate to this? And approach it with a bit of resistance. Say, he's not going to be able to answer this, because I love how far-reaching these things can be. And a lot of the times it's when people go, what, I've tried everything, why not give this a go? That they then find the thing, that's like, oh, Here it is.
Well, and isn't that funny too, that we tend to start with the most complicated solutions rather than just give a try to the ones that seem too simple
Yeah.
before we figure out that that really was the answer. And I will say this, so I originally connected with you on Instagram, and you give out so much great information on Instagram. So if people just go follow you there, they'll really get a sense of who you are and what you're doing and how knowledgeable you are about this.
Yeah, and I tried to, that's where I just funnel most of my, content into, because I think that's, you can learn a lot, right? Of like, oh, well, let me try that, 1 minute practice. And that's where people go, well, actually, I do feel a little bit different. What could be the next thing that I try? Or what if I do that 1 minute practice for 5 minutes? Or what if I do it 3 times a day, And that's where you start to build almost this cumulative effect that then starts to really change how you feel.
Absolutely. Well, my last question for you, the underlying theme of this podcast is seeking greater peace and joy in life. And so it's a little bit of a softball pitch question, but how does breath work lead people toward greater joy in their life?
I think breath allows us to be more present with, the moments that can often get lost in the noise and the stimulus and the to-do list. And if I can, bring myself back to this present moment and appreciate, the joy and the peace and the beauty of whatever's happening right now around me, and that's not to say that we just pretend everything's good, but often there are these little moments, that can be a moment of bliss or joy or presence if we actually have the ability to sit and be with it, But if my mind is always racing and my body's always tense, it's very hard to appreciate those moments because I'm just kind of being bounced around like a bit of a pinball. And so breath gives us that opportunity to, be a little bit more present with each breath, and in that be a little bit more present with each moment.
I totally agree with you. I say that often, that joy is all around you all the time. It's just so often we simply don't notice it. We just blow right past it. And learning how to control your breath sounds like it just brings you down into a center.
Yeah, and it allows us to notice those things that we're often failing to recognize or failing to notice, because we are always rushing or there always is something to do. And so the breath, that's with us we breathe 25,000 times every day. Like, how many breaths today did I notice, right? And was I grateful for?
Yeah.
Most people it's 0, Oh, I noticed that one breath, which was a sigh of frustration. Right. But what if, I often pose this to people, maybe tomorrow you can try and be present, right, and aware of 1% of the breaths you take in a day. Just 1%, right? That's probably 200 breaths,
Yeah.
But imagine if 200 times you just paused and you felt gratitude for this arriving inhale. And as you exhale, you felt your body relax. And then you moved on, you forgot about it, And then 10 minutes later, an hour later, you go, oh, here's a moment. And you really felt the breath, right? As it enters your body, as it does tens of thousands of times, right? But you were sat with it and you were present and you were grateful of it. I think you'll be very surprised at what happens at the end of the day. Because, like you said, how many moments of joy that were all around me that I miss.
Yeah.
But it's something like, well, I had that really beautiful moment when I stopped and I paused and I felt the wind and I took that breath and then I kind of moved on, and those things build up.
Yeah, life is amazing. And again, like you said, it's not that you just walk around with rose-colored glasses and don't ignore the fact that there's problems. Of course there's problems, but that's all the more reason to reach for all the joy that you can. It doesn't make the problems go away, but it sure makes that moment more of a moment of bliss.
I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for being my guest today, Campbell. This has been a great conversation, and I would encourage everybody to go follow you on Instagram and learn from you and just look up all the different ways that you might be able to help them.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to come and dive into a conversation that I think is, I love to talk about it, and it sounds like you do as well. So I appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you for joining me today on the Joyfulicity podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share, and come follow me on all major social media sites at Joyfulicity or on my website, joyfulicity.com. You can follow the link in the description for this episode to all of the places that we can connect. Have a great day, everybody, and remember, dare to dream, plan to play, live to learn.